American Nativism, how the bipartisan war on immigrants explains politics as we know it. Give you a little more info on Daniel. Daniel's a fellow at Brown University's Watson Institute and the host of The Dig, a podcast from Jacobin Magazine.
All correct.
His work has appeared everywhere. New York Times, Jacobin, Vox, Nation, Guardian. You've probably seen an article by him if you've read anything in the last couple of years. We're lucky to have him tonight. We've got a little bit of a time crunch. He's got another event after this, so we're going to have a nice little discussion maybe and just open it up for some questions. Hold your questions to the end of the discussion and then we'll get to you. Okay. Start out with, I guess, nativism. How do you define nativism?
Well, nativism is a word that's peculiarly American to describe xenophobia, anti-immigrant sentiment. And one reason I like the word is because in the American context, it helps us understand how European settlers, because we often forget that, like, oh, why are all these white people in North America? Well, came from Europe. It was a settler colonial project. Moved here to dispossess indigenous people of their land and establish a new nation in its place. So a big part of the question of nativism is how did settlers become natives in their own minds, in our own minds, and then become nativists, because the anti-immigrant sentiment, this idea of you're not welcome in my country, first requires this process of normalizing the idea that it's our country. And so I start my book way back then with the beginning of European settlement in North America.
Cool.
For that reason, because it shows that from the get-go, the entire project of colonial settlement and then of the independent United States is consistently one of a racial population politics, specifically about ensuring that certain types of people are in certain places doing specific types of work with specific sorts of statuses. So this great book that I really recommend that influenced me a lot it's either called Building This American Empire or Building an American Empire, I don't remember, by Paul Freimer, who's a political scientist, I think at Princeton.
Do you reference that in here?
Yep.
So we can find it in here.
Okay.
Okay, thanks.
His book is really, really excellent. It shows how, through extensive documentation, how the way this country got from the 13 original colonies to the 50 states that we have today was through like a very methodical politics around ensuring white majorities as the nation expanded westward. All the way up through the early 20th century when New Mexico took a very long time to be admitted as a state into the Union because, and this is all in the congressional debate, it's not a secret or conspiracy theory, because there were so many indigenous and Mexican people there. There were proposals to combine it with Arizona so that more white people would kind of overwhelm all the other people there. And so I think something somewhat different I do in my book than most other histories of immigration politics is putting the history of anti-immigrant politics into that broader history that of trying to control race in place from white settlement moving west to the forced migration of Africans here as enslaved people to the one of the massive fears before the end of the Civil War about the prospect of abolition was that black people would move north.
Yes.
And indeed, that fear and the resistance to that fear has been one of the central, the resistance to that migration has been one of the central features of American politics through that day, the Black Great Migration, when millions of black people moved from the South to places from Philadelphia to Los Angeles, and in response, many white people moved from Philadelphia to out here, or from Camden to out here.
Right. Where are you from?
and so yeah, which I assume is a biblical reference of some sort.
I think so. There's no mountain here. So I don't
Yeah, there's
know.
no mountain. I see no mountain.
I don't know.
I don't feel elevated
We're
at
in
all.
the town.
Bulldozed it to build the
I'll have
town.
to
Wait a
look into
minute,
that.
you go uphill to get to Kings Highway.
Yeah.
So there's
Yeah,
a
when you
little,
go-
little elevation, little
A
incline.
little, yeah,
More of a
yeah.
hill than a.
So
Could be
Kind of
more
back
comfortable.
Hill Ephraim.
so it's sort of like that's the, you know, there's all those other
Mini mountain Ephraim.
and immigration politics as it's conventionally understood, like i.e. people coming from another country to this country, is interwoven into all of that other history from the get-go. It's the 1790, the first immigration law in this country was the 1790 Naturalization Act, which opened citizenship to free white persons.
Yes.
And then in the early 19th century, you have anti-Irish politics, but immigration, by and large, naturalization is a federal thing, but immigration, by and large, is a state thing. And you have states that are major port states like Massachusetts and New York. They have their own immigration officers and their own immigration laws, and especially Protestant Massachusetts deports huge numbers of Irish people, of poor Irish people, who are seen as racially other because they're so poor. So it's their economic condition that racializes them. And then this guy Hidetaka Hirota, a historian, has a great book on that called Expelling the Poor. And then in 1882, the first federal immigration law was passed, the Immigration Act of 1882. That very same year, the Chinese Exclusion Act is passed, which bars basically all Chinese workers from entering the country. And again, because of their economic position, because they're so brutally exploited, they're portrayed as racially other. Their dependent position in the labor market is mapped onto them as like a racially other people, as though they are servile, as though they're inherently, biologically, culturally servile. Over the next few decades, Asians from all sorts of other countries are progressively banned until by the 1920s they're almost entirely banned, except for who? Except for Filipinos, basically. Why? Because the U.S. has seized Philippines in the Spanish-American War at the turn of the century. And when the Philippines is ultimately granted independence, the same law that does that provides for them being barred from the country as well. And so there's this long history that, you know, I can hit a few more points if you want for the broad outline to bring us more to the present. At the same time that the Asian ban is consolidated and made nearly total in the 1920s, you have this other, after you have the anti-immigrant forces, the nativist forces, turning their attention to disfavored Europeans. And this is a time when eugenics is big, and a big way to think about human difference in the world. And the idea is that all of this immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe is going to destroy the white Anglo-Saxon stock. So they passed something called the National Origins Quotas Act, which dramatically restricts immigration from specifically targeting Southern and Eastern Europe. And immigration is, except for the Western Hemisphere, which is another story, was overwhelmingly, what little there was from Ireland, England, and Germany from the 1920s to the 1960s, until President Johnson signed something called the Hart-Celler Act in 1965. So who's immigrating to do all the low-wage, crappy labor in the early 20th century, given that you have all these Asians banned, all of these Eastern and Southern Europeans tightly restricted? Mexicans. The U.S. has recently expanded itself into what was recently half of Mexico's territory, and you have booming agricultural industry in the Southwest. And with World War II, you get something called the Bracero Program. It's a guest worker program. It brings millions of Mexicans workers here as guest workers, not as full citizens, but just as kind of reduced to just worker with very minimal rights. And many others come without authorization too. during that period. And so throughout this whole period where immigration is shut down from everywhere else, you have this system of cross-border Mexican labor migration becoming institutionalized, systematized. 1965, the national origins quotas are abolished. It's kind of the civil rights era liberalism, like an end to formally racist immigration laws. But at the same time, the Bracero Program comes to an end. In part for good reason. There was a lot of abuses in the program. Guest worker programs are kind of fundamentally abusive of immigrant workers. But then the new law to replace the national origins quota is on its face racially neutral, but functionally incredibly discriminatory, because it gives the same number of visas, I believe 20,000 annually, to every country in the world. So whether you're Belgium or Mexico, you get 20,000. Mexico, who we have this massive system of ongoing labor migration in place. And so what happens is that labor migration continues, but the government illegalizes it. And that's where the Mexican as illegal immigrants comes from. It's no major change necessarily in anything that Mexicans were doing. It was a decision that the government made. To illegalize a pre-existing system of labor migration. And then we can get into more recent decades, but that's kind of like the big picture of how American capitalism, American empire, and I mean empire from the beginning, because the United States is an empire. Right. We're a transcontinental empire that was built over centuries. That's always been about controlling the racialized people in a certain way, and immigration politics is part of that.
As we're speaking about controlling actual bodies and bodies movements within the country and from without the country. That's a great overview of you've just given us a basic overview of the whole country.
Just a few hundred years.
I wanted to focus now on, when I came to the book, I was thinking Trump. I just had Trump on the brain. I think when you think nativism, you think Trump.
Trump's given us all brain disease. It's fine.
You have a great quote in the book where you say, Trump is merely the result of American politics at its most usual, which really struck a chord with me, because he's coming out and plainly saying things that seem kind of outrageous when you first hear them. Right. They're things that have continually been done behind doors or thought behind doors.
Yeah, can I grab your book?
Yes, absolutely.
That was basically my motivation in initially writing the book. I first proposed it after Trump had won the nomination. I'm not clairvoyant. I didn't know he was going to win the general. I, like everyone else, was like,
I thought it was interesting, but
he's so nuts. And I'm no fan of Hillary Clinton's, but I was like, oh, she'll be him.
Yes.
But no.
I think a lot of us thought that. Yeah.
But from the moment he won the nomination, or even when he was just rising towards the nomination, the response from a lot of liberals who dislike Trump, and correct to dislike Trump, he's a grotesque, horrible person.
Yes.
Deeply cruel and weird.
But we can spend 2 hours on
the
adjectives you want to use, but yes, I'm with you.
And on some level, it's certainly incomparable. He's an idiosyncratic individual.
Yes.
But this idea that the thing that was most central to his campaign, which was indisputably his anti-immigrant politics, that Mexicans are rapists and criminals,
Right.
Yes.
that the Muslims, we don't know what they're up to, we gotta ban them.
Yes.
Bad hombres. Yeah, that this was an entirely new thing, almost something that coincidentally, ironically enough, like immigration, had to be a foreign origin.
Yes.
As though we needed to pick up that idea through Russian bots or something.
Right.
That this is not normal. That whole idea, which was coming from a good place, maybe from some people, but also from a place of ignorance, frankly, because it's all too normal, and that's why I wrote the book. Yeah. We have decades, particularly since the early 90s, but also this longer history that I'm talking about, of Mexican immigration in particular being described as a criminal threat and as an economic threat for the political purposes by Democrats like Bill Clinton and Barack Obama, by Republicans like Governor Pete Wilson of California and George W. Bush. describing them as economic drains, a drain of welfare, an economic threat in terms of undocumented workers taking your job. Then after 9/11, Muslims and them immigrants being a terrorist threat,
Yes.
being grafted onto that. Trump did not invent that. That comes very, very much out of the Bush administration's politics and policies. And so there's a reason, even though it's more extreme, more brazen, Trump is different in some ways. Some of his policies are certainly more cruel. But there's a reason that his rhetoric resonated. And there's a reason that he had institutions to do the things that he's done with them. Because, Trump said, build the wall. But there was already a wall built before Trump built office. In the
There's
early
over 500 miles of wall,
over 600,
right? Before he took office.
Yeah, over 600. There was almost no fencing at all along the U.S.-Mexico border in the early 1990s. Now we have like about 650, 700 miles of fencing along the U.S.-Mexico border, thanks to his predecessors. Thanks, for example, in significant part, to the Secure Fence Act of 2006, which was signed into law by George W. Bush and voted for in the Senate by people like Joe Biden, Barack Obama, and Hillary Clinton. We had a few thousand, 3,000 or 4,000, I can't remember, Border Patrol agents in the early 1990s. Today we have nearly 20,000. Trump didn't do that. That was Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, and Barack Obama maintained those levels.
Do you think the machine really started with Clinton, really started escalating? That's the era?
Yeah. I mean, that's
the
when
deportation machine.
Yeah, I mean, there are periods of mass deportation before, under Eisenhower in the early 1950s, right in 1930 or so, a massive forced repatriation campaign of Mexicans. But the war on immigrants, as we know it today, in many ways really begins in the 1990s. And why does it begin? It begins for a lot of reasons, because anti-immigrant activists have been trying to mainstream the issue for decades. They broke through in the 90s, I think in large part because there was this diffuse anxiety about borders. Like, it was the end of the Cold War, and the US emerged as the sole superpower. Yet, when George H.W. Bush declared that there was this new world order after the US won in the first Gulf War, there wasn't the sense of it gave many Americans a sense of like unease about what was happening, of like shadowy forces, and with NAFTA and the rise of globalization. And so a very easy scapegoat for all of these anxieties, and this is after decades of the US economic situation growing worse and worse for most people, stagnating wages beginning in the 1970s with the rise of the economic system that we refer to as neoliberalism. Immigrants in general, Mexicans in particular, make for a very useful scapegoat. This is the same period where there's all the anti-welfare politics that lead to the passage of welfare reform. And obviously, like this, what's often remembered is that depended on the kind of pathologization and demonization of Black mothers on welfare, but also it did the same to immigrant mothers. And what happened before the passage of welfare reform in 1996 was the passage of a bill in California called Proposition 187. And that's really the beginning of the story in a way. It was a referendum. It passed by a strong margin with very strong support from white people, but also significant support from Hispanics and Black people in California at the time, that barred undocumented immigrants from all public services, including public education. Much of that was blocked in court later, but there was this whole sense that it was suddenly a live, hot issue, and you had Clinton and Republicans, Clinton and Democrats versus other Republicans sort of competing to out-tough each other. There's a great website called The Living Room Candidate, I think it's called, which has campaign ads from every presidential election for which there are any, going back to I think 52 might have been the first ads. Watch the 96 ads from Dole and Clinton.
Oh, wow.
Like, some of the Clinton ads, you would be like, is this a Donald Trump ad?
Wow.
Yeah, right.
We had to say it to get elected, right?
So we thought.
Yeah.
He took on the same exact language though. Sure. If you study him through that period, it is the same language.
Yeah.
As the far right.
So here's here's
Oh,
Clinton
wow.
in 1995.
Yeah, it's shocking.
Our nation was built by immigrants, but we won't tolerate immigration by people whose first act is to break the law as they enter our country. It's Bill Clinton in 1995.
That might be their only act of breaking the law.
Yeah.
Coming here, they might not be a criminal after that.
Yeah, and especially because again, after 1965 and then another law that was passed in 1976,
Right.
this whole come the right way thing, they're not like, they're not, it's not so easy to come the right way. Like
Right.
if you have to get in a line that in some cases from oversubscribed countries like Mexico,
Right.
if you're like a brother of a US citizen
Yeah.
or something, could take 20 years.
Yes.
I mean, it's like there's no line.
Right.
You see that being curtailed a lot is preferential visas for people with siblings in the States. That used to be first priority. So the first thing to do is cut that back.
Yeah.
You're waiting longer and longer. You're no longer a priority because your brother lives in the States.
And Trump wants to basically get rid of the family-based immigration
After
entirely.
he brought Melania and her parents
Yeah.
here.
He's fine with European model immigrants.
Right, I got
She's
mine,
white.
but now I'm
She's
gonna
white,
shut off the
yeah.
faucet.
Yeah. Every American deserves a Slovenian supermodel wife immigrant. That's the basic. It's in the
Thank
Constitution.
Can you quickly go, because I have a hard time whenever I'm talking to people, Obama.
Yeah.
Okay. If you look at his record, it's horrendous.
Yeah.
On this issue. Now, when you see him speaking, he's a nice guy, he's charming, he's intelligent.
Irresistible.
We were talking about this before. So just give us some facts about what he did while he was in office that people might have ignored or not know, but there are horrible things that he did.
We're going to step back to Bush a little bit and then
Okay.
to get into Obama to
Okay.
get some context.
Right.
So beginning in the 2000s, kind of both liberal and conservative establishment figures, including Bush and then Obama, and then others in Congress, are pushing for something called comprehensive immigration reform. And the goal is to get legal status for undocumented immigrants, for like the 11 million odd undocumented immigrants in the country, but to include these enforcement escalations to sweeten the deal, to get right-wing anti-immigrant people in Congress to support it. So, and then also guest worker programs for business, because business wants guest worker programs. And these things never pass because right-wing anti-immigrant forces are radicalizing in Congress, led by people like Tom Tancredo and Jim Sensenbrenner. And they won't vote for anything that they consider amnesty. And so already these bills are pretty problematic because they include measures to increasingly militarize the border and whatnot. But what's even worse is that you have Bush and then Obama taking unilateral actions to look tough on border security and look tough on immigration enforcement in the hope that that will win them credibility with the right wing in Congress, and then the right wing in Congress will come around to supporting comprehensive immigration reform. I mean, which is diluted because the right wing in Congress, entirely psychopathic, negotiate. That's not what they do. And why would you, if they, given that Obama and Bush are doing these standalone escalation measures, they're getting what they want for free. So why would they don't need to give anything in return? It would be illogical. And so, you have the huge buildup of border fencing, which beginning under Bush, which in many places looks like what Trump would call a wall.
Right.
I don't know if you've ever seen the Tijuana, San Diego border. It's a wall. I mean, it's a fence, but it's a wall. It's it's like
it's there.
double layer, Yeah. So, and then you have these spectacular workplace raids where hundreds of low-wage immigrant meatpacking workers are picked up, to send a message that, we're getting tough against people who are doing back-breaking labor for nothing.
So we wouldn't do.
Yeah.
Right.
That we don't want to do.
Yeah.
And then under Obama, you have deportations reach historical record highs. And he is labeled by many in the immigrant rights movement the deporter in chief.
I've heard that, yes.
And but the thing is, for in the 1990s, when this really kicks off, there's a bipartisan consensus on the ground, like amongst ordinary people, like that, in support of the war on immigrants. Republican and Democratic public opinion is similarly anti-immigrant in the 1990s and through the early 2000s. But there's this bill passed in December 2005 called the Sensenbrenner Bill, which is an extremely draconian bill that passes the House, does not pass the Senate, that would have made it a crime to be an undocumented immigrant. Right now it's not, it's a civil offense. It is a crime to cross the border without authorization. It's not a crime just to be here though. You're subject to deportation if you're here without documents, but there's nothing, and it's not illegal. It's not a criminal offense, it's a civil offense. This would have made it a criminal offense and would have criminalized potentially people providing aid to undocumented immigrants. And so in 2006, some of you may remember, in response, there were massive immigrant rights protests in response to this. And that's where the movement that we still have today really kicks off. They're huge, hundreds of thousands of people in LA, Chicago, Philadelphia, like I think over 500,000 in LA alone. And it's at that moment that the bipartisan war on immigrants gets so extreme that it begins to lose bipartisan support. And opinions on immigration begin to polarize, which is both dangerous in some ways and very good in some ways. It's dangerous because today we have Trump and an increasing number of Republicans, for example, believe now, like 4 years later than they did in 2016, many more Republicans than prior believe that immigration threatens our national identity, like very explicitly adopt a kind of racialized look at immigration than before. But at the same time, the overall American public in general and Democratic voters in particular are perhaps more pro-immigrant than at any time in this country's history. And so we have the danger on the right, but also this bipartisan war that brought us to Trump no longer has bipartisan support, which also creates the opportunity for doing something entirely new and much better. So that's the good, I kind of had my book on an optimistic note.
Yes, you do.
What's the
people.
entirely new and much better plan?
Um,
Does anybody have one? I'm just curious, like, do you have one, or do you know of somebody who has one?
I think Bernie's plan is probably the best.
Right here.
Okay, I was thinking in that direction, but I wasn't sure. You made it vague on
It's a step in
purpose.
the right direction, I think.
I mean, would you say it's like disingenuous to say that Clinton or Obama were left? Like they're like center right to me, you know, in their policies. Like I don't think I've ever experienced a left candidate.
Yeah.
To be honest,
No,
in my
that's
life.
Not convincing.
That's what's
Some other
unreal
countries.
about Bernie.
Yeah.
And like other countries have candidates with this kind of politics,
Yeah.
like
All the time.
all the time.
Yeah.
In the U.S. though, we've just the left's been so marginalized for so long. And also, I think, you know, as someone who's been on the left since I was in high school in the late '90s, like we've just been kind of trying to like figure out how to do it right. And so, like in 2000, we tried, you know, the third party route, which I'll never apologize for. Because I'm sorry, we have a two-party system, and it's not obvious, like how you're supposed to fight your way out of it. And we had to have the Nader experience to get to the Bernie moment of being like, oh, actually. The party elites are vulnerable on the inside. Like you don't just have them from the outside. You can just take over the party.
Right.
They can't stop you.
Trump did it.
Yeah, exactly.
Right,
Exactly.
Exactly.
So we gotta learn from that.
Yeah, and you look at those Nevada results, and you're just like, damn.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah.
Okay, here we go.
So I think you've taken us through pretty much most of American history within 20 minutes there.
I've been doing a lot.
Yeah.
I've been doing a lot of book
You're a
events.
well-oiled machine here.
The first one or two, I was rusty, but now I'm ready for it.
You covered everything we talked that I wanted to cover. I think. I don't know if anybody has any questions that you want to ask Daniel to clarify anything that he said.
Talk about anything.
Wait, you mentioned something, I think you said the 1990s, and you were talking about the immigrants. Who exactly were the largest majority of immigrants in the 1990s?
Mexicans.
Still Mexicans. Okay.
Yeah, but actually, well, that Mexican immigration is picking up recently, but for about a decade, from the financial crisis to a few years ago, Mexican immigration had turned net negative. More Mexicans were leaving the country and entering it.
Oh wow!
And
I didn't even know that.
most immigrants since especially since 2014, but maybe before that, have been asylum seekers fleeing Central America, a region that has severe problems, and problems that on multiple levels are of the U.S.'s creation. You have wars throughout the 1980s,
Right.
dirty wars, backed by Reagan. You have Reagan backing a death squad government in El Salvador. You have Reagan backing the Contras in Nicaragua against the Sandinista government, but now people are trying to smear Bernie for having supported in the 80s. And yeah, Daniel Ortega is a total asshole now, but it was entirely correct to support the Sandinistas in the 1980s, like entirely, like no question. And death squad government in Guatemala that was carrying out a genocide against Mayan people in that country, carried out a genocide against Mayan people. And then these gangs that have become big problems in those countries, like Mara Salvatrucha, they were not formed in El Salvador. They were formed in Salvadoran refugee communities in Los Angeles. So it was their experience fleeing war and living in the hood in Los Angeles, in which Mara Salvatrucha and Calle 18 were formed.
And then they were deported.
They were
took
deported
it back to their
to countries that could not have no capacity to handle this, that were
So the
totally
gangs
broken.
formed in our country
We
in those
deported them. We
concentration
deported them
type,
back.
Yes.
and we deported them back,
Right.
and then they got stronger, and now that's what everybody's fleeing.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Wow.
Brilliant.
Yes.
Yeah.
Right. Great policy.
You speak a lot about fantasies and racial fantasies. There's a fantasy that we can create whatever chaos we want. Let's take Central America. We create total chaos, and then the people the victims of this chaos come to us. And we can't understand it.
Why are you coming here?
Because we're so committed to the notion that we're innocent.
We cannot believe it. So under Reagan, especially in the 80s, just created a total disaster in Central America. Now you have the victims, women and children coming.
And you're like,
where's
where's
the
y'all
disaster?
coming? Like,
Oh my God, this nightmare.
like,
Right.
we're all like,
Who
what are you
did this
doing
to
here?
you?
Yeah.
I guess most recently it's the caravan that was coming. The Trump was
Oh, the caravan.
Oh, the caravan.
right. I mean,
Every
this is-
day it grew by
The caravan's attractive because our policies, including our drug policies, which have unleashed this horrific drug war in Mexico, like 95% of the U.S.'s fault.
Right.
Like people are in the caravan to keep themselves safe.
They're traveling together for
from
protection.
the conditions that we felt that our country self created.
Right.
And then
Right.
then Trump can point and then be like, look at this, it's an invading army.
Yeah.
It's like other people just trying to like stay alive.
Well, another excellent takeaway that again, you don't think about this every day, but the more you militarize the border, right, you send 20,000 of our troops down there, and by showing that, you see, look what needs to be done. It's a movie.
You're highlighting, and this guy Peter Andreas, who I cite a lot,
Yeah.
I kind of take that argument with credit for him.
Right.
Yeah, that like the border enforcement, the increasing attention to the border, it never solves the problem. Like the problem really,
Right.
because immigrants come in somewhere else, or ironically, a lot of immigrants who would have previously returned to Mexico before the 1990s stay.
Yeah.
Because it's going to be harder to come back. So I'll just say, so it's something called a caging effect,
Right.
where it perversely increases the undocumented immigration population. So it has all these perverse effects, but also you're highlighting, you're literally creating the problem in your effort to solve it. And so every attempt at a crackdown just leads to an escalation in the sense that there needs to be more of a crackdown, which really moves us to this point. That makes Trump's call for a literal like wall across the entire border to hermetically seal the nation. It makes it seem reasonable, and the next logical thing to try to far too many people.
Do you want to wrap it there?
Yeah, but I can hang for a few minutes and assign book if anyone wants.
I think Frank has one more question.
Oh, sorry.
Sure. Real quick. There's a podcast I listen to called The Pessimist Archive, and there's a really great one about nostalgia narratives.
Oh, cool.
And they talk about Make America Great Again.
What's it called?
It's The Pessimist Archive on NPR. And this one episode was about, it's not a political one, but they want to investigate, like the question was, in Make America Great Again, when was again?
When was that?
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
You know, and they started to investigate what that was, and I won't, go through the whole details, but the most interesting point that in that podcast was that they went back as far as like the founding, and there were apparently there's reports there was people that were in that that we got to make America great again world in the 1700s, 18th century, that were attacking founding fathers that were still living.
Yes.
And selling out like the country.
And the founding fathers were saying, no, you're wrong.
Yeah.
You're saying you're misquoting me. You're misidentifying what I'm trying to do. Like in that exact, like even with living founding fathers.
Right.
So it's fascinating.
Trump the other day, I just heard this today, was talking at the Academy Awards, and was
he was
all pissed about Parasite, and he was like, remember Hollywood used to be good, we used to have, and he started talking about like I forget what movie it was, but like 50s. Gone with the Wind, yes, Gone with the Wind. We used to have Gone with the Wind, folks, right? Wasn't that great, folks? Oh.
Yep.
People are saying that we're losing control of our Oscars. He's now created a story where this is now an issue. Every film that's made that year can be nominated.
There's no way Trump would understand. If Trump understood Parasite, he would have to commit suicide.
He's going to say, what the hell was that?
He would have to be able to read.
Yeah. We don't know if
Right. True. Yeah, that's a good point.
Or listen to his advice.
We know you can tweet, or somebody's tweeting for him. I don't know. And then I want to thank Daniel so much for being here.
Thank you.
Woo! If you haven't grabbed this book, All American Nativism.
Ta-da!
Ta-da!
Someone on Twitter the other day was like, cool book cover, why does it have 61 stars? I was like, oh, I don't know, I never counted. It's just the things that people do on Twitter. I'm like,
people don't notice the barbed wire. I mean,
it
takes a while to go, oh yeah, I get it
Barbed
now.
wire.
Oh, now I get it. This is some
That's a
left
great
wing.
cover.
Yeah, thanks.
This guy's a leftist.